to The Holy City is for Everyone. We are recording our second to last episode on your birthday, honey. Happy birthday.
Thank you, honey. Lovely to spend my birthday with you.
I wonder how happy you are to be discussing the Whore of Babylon on your birthday. Does that feel celebratory in any way? No, not quite. It's a funny mix. It's life.
It is.
It is just life.
There is a victory in the short unfolding of our chapters today, though, so we can rest in that.
We can rest in that. And these chapters, I admit kind of a little bit ashamedly, they precede Revelation 21, which is at the heart of my tradition, which I have preached on more times than I can count. And I confess that I have not dwelled on chapter 17 through 20 very often, if at all. And so it really was quite a thing to wade into these stories. And I assume they're also not passages that you are preaching on that often in the Episcopal Church. Is that correct?
In the lectionary cycle, these readings generally don't come up, no. And we draw upon some of the lovely passages from Revelation for funerals and memorial services, like Revelation 7, Revelation 21. So I've encountered these passages in my own personal reading and study, but no, they're not really woven into the lectionary cycle I think for understandable reasons. They take a lot to unpack, which is why we're doing a podcast to get into it. To do that in a 15, 20-minute sermon, you'd have a hard time, I think. It's not you can accuse the lectionary makers of avoiding, but I think they're really just trying to make good liturgical decisions there.
No, it's not surprising that we don't go here that often. And I'm glad we're going, but I'm glad we're going to go there today, because I am reflecting on, if my faith is in this vision of the Holy City, it's probably important to also consider what is it that needs to come down if this new thing is going to rise up.
Make space for the new, sure.
Yeah, and that's really
what this is. It was somehow it had never been clear in my mind, but really this is the contrast of two cities.
Yeah.
It's the contrast of the city of Babylon, which becomes a major symbolic motif in chapter 18, and the city of the New Jerusalem and how they function. And somehow I just never clicked in my mind that we're being showed mirrored pairs, which is a recurring motif in Revelation in particular, and a lot of Bible stories and books in general. And so I think it's helpful for us to hold it in that way. We're being shown the antithesis of what we hope for and what God desires for us.
Yeah. And I think it's very helpful. And I'm realizing that reading this is giving me a deeper understanding of what we'll be getting into next week. It gives me a little frame for this image of the Whore of Babylon, this prostitute, this image of a woman prostitute, and being a contrast to the Holy City, which is the bride. So this contrast of the one who is in relationship purely through it's a financial transaction to get your needs met or to be satisfied, versus a real relationship of unity and mutuality, which is where we're headed.
And covenant and commitment.
Yeah. What else might we want to say about this disturbing, difficult image of a prostitute, of a woman being shown as the symbol of this city, or this perversion of what community looks like?
I think I'd like to do something I've done so often in our conversation, which is remind us that we're on a spiral here, and we're back at the beginning point again, right? The cycle of the seven trumpets has just ended, and this is what happens next. And the ending is a beginning, and we're where we started again. And where we started, we always have to ground ourselves in this, is John writing those 7 letters to those 7 churches and describing their experience in light of higher spiritual truths. And as we've gone up the spiral, up the 7 seals, up the 7 trumpets, up the 7, I guess it was vials or censers and bowls, and now the 7 trumpets, we're still, the same reality is still there.
Yeah.
So, and here we also have the motif that occurred earlier in the book of John going into a trance, right? He's going into multiple trances. So he's kind of, in my take, that's saying he's going on higher and higher levels of consciousness to see more and more from a higher perspective. What is this whole reality?
Yeah.
that he finds himself in, grounded on the ground at Patmos. And so
And
he's
in contrast to some of the other times he was carried away in the spirit, now he's carried away in the spirit into a desert or a
and
wilderness.
yeah, and I want to play there with the text,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because the angel invites him to come, right? And he whether it's conscious or not, he says yes, and he's led it to this experience. And the invitation of the angel is that the great prostitute is seated on deep waters. And then where does he go? To a desert where there is no water, right? So that's something for us, I think, to pay attention to. And here's where we haven't picked up at it as much in the last couple of sessions, but this is where dream work can really help us start to unpack the symbolism here. Because if you're being told this, I'm going to avoid the prostitute horror word as much as I can, this woman is seated on deep waters, and then you go to a place where there is no water, and there's a serpent, you can assume that the serpent is being presented to us as the manifestation of water and a kind of perversion of water that's not fulfilling its natural function. It's actually concentrated, into this monstrous animal. The ground that needs the water is not getting it. It's lifeless, right? So we're getting a key idea here, which is the concentration of things. I'm going to use resources, but it's going to be about a lot of things, and largely it's going to be about money. The concentration of resources to the detriment of the whole. That's what we're being shown immediately. And the serpent, familiar motifs, right? Was 7 heads, 10 horns, or is it 10 horns? Whatever it is, right? It's that, there it is, 7 heads and 10 horns. We've heard that, for the serpent. We've heard it for the beast from the sea. We're hearing it again. So presumably this is not the dragon, right? Presumably it's different. It's of its ilk. It's got the same kind of energy in its head formation, but it's different. It's now tied to this woman who's a very powerful, mysterious, and frightening being. And there's another line there that I think, and again, grounding ourselves in the idea of Revelation's John's experience. This would be verse 6b. I was completely stunned when I saw her. Something about his experience of her is stunning to him. Like he can barely take it in. Worth noting.
Well, and for me, that image of being carried into the desert feels like a kind of dark night of the soul
Yep.
invitation. And so
Place of temptation. Yes.
that experience of being astonished, just like his eyes are, he is seeing something that is unveiling the depth of, a depth that he has not experienced before, a depth of
Yeah.
reality.
Yeah. I'm having a thought about that. And we're going to circle back to sexuality and women as this conversation unfolds. But here's the thought that just came into my mind. I think there's an animating question for John that we've highlighted before. How can this be the world that is God's world, where the Romans have just run roughshod over everyone, where power and wealth are corrupted in the hands of a few, where the values of the God of justice and mercy and love are just devalued, and Christians are killed, Christians are exiled? How can this be? That's the question he's asking. And in this moment, he's seeing how powerful are the forces of this world, the spiritual forces active in this world, making it the world that he sees. And it's not so different from the world that we see, although we'll talk more about that as we go on. And that seems to me important, right? Why is he stunned? He's like, wow, this is what's animating the
This
world.
is why he's
This is
almost
why
getting
my
his
world is
answer.
yeah,
Yeah.
this is why the world is the way it is. I can't believe it. Wow, right? And that's not adequate, right? But he's
Yeah.
stunned.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
stunned.
And I know there's question about whether this John is the same John that sat with Jesus at the table, and some suspicion of whether that's true. But for whatever reason, he carries that deep love of Jesus and that like experience of Christ. And I can relate to that. It's like when you have that experience and that closeness, you do go like, what? How can we live in this? How can we
How
be
could this be the
horrible to
world
each
we
other?
live in?
Well, it can be so good. It could be so good. And yeah, this feels like a deep unveiling of the why of it not being good. And I like what you said about the sea being this accumulation of resources. It transmutes into the image of the dragon, and then it transmutes again to these 7 hills on which the woman sits that are also 7 kings.
Hmm.
which when I was diving into sort of some of the Swedenborgian correspondence, he talks about hills and kings kind of, he's always talking about goodness and truth and the way in which that plays out in a holy marriage in the holy city, as we'll see, but then often in perverted couplings where goodness is coupled with falsity or misunderstanding, and then truth is coupled with evil or malintent, and that misalignment is part of this image of the prostitute, of the one who is exchanging sex for money, for resources, instead of the sexual union that is so beautiful, that creates life and that binds us together in families and communities. So there's something in all of this that is about that misalignment and perversion when goodness and truth are not fully joined,
Hmm. Yeah.
but separated.
This is that section with the kings, the seven hills, and all that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Often New Testament biblical scholars will connect it to John's time, right? And Rome was famously built
From
on
on
seven
hills.
hills, right? So this is a way to talk about Rome. And I think you'll hear some New Testament scholarship about Revelation. It's like a code so that they could safely critique Rome. That wouldn't be much of a code, right? There's
That'd be pretty blatant.
no Roman citizen would read that and not understand what was being
Yeah.
referred to.
Yeah.
And I want to push against that a little bit and ground us, our conversation, ground for the listeners, their understanding of this book in an experience. John's having an experience, and that this symbol should arise with Roman motifs. That makes sense. That he's trying to think, how can I talk about Rome without getting in trouble? Let me talk about that's nonsense. It makes no sense,
Mm-hmm.
especially as crazy as the rest of the book is.
Right.
He's having spiritual experiences in which the motif of Rome's legacy shows up, but it's not a code to talk about it that way.
Yeah.
It's more than that.
It's
And I think, too, that this passage, the 10 kings who arise for a time and all that, I think we have to hold all that really lightly because this can trip people up, right? Because it sounds so focused and specific. And there's a reason for that that I think goes back to the book of Daniel, actually, and what scholarship understands about the book of Daniel. And for folks who read the Bible literally, this will be very difficult to hear or controversial, or you'll push it aside. The book of Daniel is not written in the time of Daniel, which was in the 500s before Jesus. It was written sometime in the 100s during the Maccabean rebellion, right? When the Jewish people were back in their homeland, but there was, in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquest, the kingdoms that was on top of the Holy Land were just really corrupt, awful people, and they fought for their freedom. And in Daniel, there's this point where they're describing events that if you lived in that time, you would know, right? And it's projected into the past, but it's being written about the present, right? It's not evidence of future knowledge. That was evidence of someone in their time trying to give their people courage and talking about events that were unfolding and saying God's known this all along. So keep the struggle, keep the faith. I think that's really important because that's playing out here, and
yeah.
it's just different stuff.
Yeah.
It's just different stuff.
Yeah.
And our Jewish brothers and sisters, they recognize this about the book of Daniel in a really powerful way. If you get a Bible published for broad Christian audience, you're going to find the book of Daniel following the book of Isaiah, the book of Jeremiah, and the book of Ezekiel, looking like it's one of the big prophetic books in the Bible. If you buy a Jewish Bible, a Tanakh edition of the Bible, you won't find Daniel with the prophets. You'll find Daniel in the catch-all section called the writings. That's because the Jewish people, Jewish scholars, Jewish rabbis recognize this is not a prophetic book. It's different. And we fall into the trap as Christians of thinking, oh, Daniel's one of the prophets. He's not. It's an apocalyptic writing from much later in history than when the events were alleged. And the influence of that book on this book is profound, but this book is totally grounded in John's experience. It's not trying to take events and translate them into the contemporary context of John's time to give people hope. It's not that. This looks like that, but it's not. It's functioning on broad symbolic levels
Mhm.
that I think we can only put so much on.
Well, and that's helpful to come back to John's context. You've been so good at bringing us back to that this is his experience. And I've been kind of, as I've been reading this and reflecting and doing some of my Swedenborgian reflection and reading, when Swedenborg read this, he read it and interpreted it through his experience and through his time. And much of what he shares about the symbology of the book of Revelation is that it has to do with the end of the Christian church. You know, he's writing in the 1700s, which probably most of us would not say was the time of the end of the Christian church. You know, this is right after the Reformation. But he's sort of looking at all of this energy of the Catholic Church's history, the Reformations, what's forming with these new sects. And he's criticizing all of it. He's sort of criticizing all of it. And his main criticism, as I've mentioned before, is this criticism against faith separated from charity, faith separated from life, faith that is grounded purely in correct belief or kind of correct devotional action versus real transformation, which I think we're speaking about and which this book really is calling to, this real transformation of life.
Change your heart.
And people, right? And so it's interesting thinking about his time and then, as you mentioned, you know, thinking about ours. So again, this is John's experience. We need to remember that it's grounded in his time. And yet what I think if you read any beautiful text of any historical time that we continue to read thousands of years later, it's because there are these motifs that have deeper, more universal themes that do just keep playing out. And certainly when
Absolutely.
I look at the world today, I mean, I think a lot of what Swedenborg was seeing is actually made more manifest. I think in 1700s, there was still quite a lot of respect and faith in the Christian church as kind of this reality that was in everybody's blood and bones and wasn't questioned. Whereas now, I think for a huge portion of the population, the brand of Christianity has been sullied, tainted. You know, it is seen as a corruption, you know, not everywhere, definitely not, you know, there are places where really good people are trying to stay, you know, faithful to Jesus's original message and live that into being. And many are not. And sometimes it's the loudest ones that are not. And we think we sort of see that in here. You know, the woman is dressed in purple and glittering gold and precious stones and pearls. And there's sort of this embellishment of that magnificence of life, which I think is one of the ways the church perverts the teaching by using it to control, to hold power or persuade for selfish ends, which is what Swedenborg said this was really about, that the beast is how the word is perverted when the church, when the faithful use it to control and to manipulate. And it doesn't last. It's messy. You know, right before we get to chapter 18, I was sort of struck in that, like 17 verses 15 through 18. Yeah, the kings are controlled by the woman, but then there's also the beast also battles the woman. You know, there's sort of chaos in this city, which I think is certainly what I see in the world today. Is that that power that attempt to control and hold power always ends up causing conflict, because then others come in and they want power, and so it's like power is not very cooperative with one another. So in some ways it writes its own end or its own destruction. Anything else you want to say about chapter 17?
I think we can recognize the forces, for lack of a better word, that are manifest in the images and then the symbols as recurrent. Right. And I think that's a great way to think about what Revelation is offering us. It's offering us visions of spiritual forces, good and evil, and how they impact our world. And with that knowledge, how we're called to respond. And here's a big change. The saints are told nothing to do in this section, right? That information's already been given. And it's noted that the woman is drunk, with the blood of the saints. And not just saints, the followers of Jesus. And I'm not recalling the phrase.
The blood of
the saints and the blood of Jesus' witnesses, right? Which is an interesting distinction in my mind. I would wonder about the Greek, but I'm not going to lean into it right now. Is the saints that sense of anyone who was of good heart, right? Is it that broad sense? I would wonder about that. And that continues in the next chapter. There's nothing told to the saints about what to do. We've already been given our instructions. If we have our allegiance to Jesus and we're trying to manifest him in this world, we're now seeing how spiritual forces are going to be dealt with that are contrary to Jesus' teachings and ways and God's teachings and ways. And I think that's powerful. And it's such a shift. It's worth noting in this section that we're walking through.
I guess the only other line that seems somewhat meaningful to me is we hear it a few times about the beast, that he once was now is not, and yet will come, which is sort of an interesting play, because we often hear about Jesus as the one who was, the one who is, the one who is to come. There's this always will be. And now we have a play on, well, it was, but now it isn't, and then it's going to be again, which I think an interesting way to think about evil, or to think about the destructive forces, that they're real, and John is seeing them, and John is witnessing them, and he's astonished, and it's pretty powerful, and yet it's also not. It's like it's a force that has always been, and yet is, I don't know, there's a waffling or something there that feels meaningful. I think when I think about my own faith life, I think there, when I rest in silence, there's a steadiness, there's a consistency, and I think that's the message we get about what God is. God is always was, always will be. There's this eternity, this wholeness that can't change, and yet there are forces in the world that are evil and that are destructive, but they are not abiding. And I just find that very useful, and I think it reflects what we're seeing in this story. It's very ugly, it's very messy, it's very real on one level, but it's not real on every level, I guess.
Yeah. And such a radical idea in John's time,
Mm-hmm.
when how could one imagine that the Roman Empire would fall unless you looked at every other empire that had ever been in the ancient world and recognized this too will pass.
Yeah.
It's a radical thought.
I was reading one commentary. Isn't it true that when this was written, Babylon already wasn't very powerful anymore? Like that
Babylon had fallen long ago.
Yeah.
Yes,
So this is using the image of Babylon as already a society that had been destroyed.
That was at the peak of world dominance and has faded from the scene. And to say to Rome, that's your fate too.
So now we come to the fall of Babylon. And another angel comes to proclaim what is occurring. And is there much more to say about it other than it just feels like a real story of this is over? Yes, you had your fun, you sold your goods, you had all of this, plenty, but it is no more. It is time for it to end.
One of the things that struck me about this vision is in the section of the merchants of the earth, right? There's this cycle of those who weep, right? It's the kings, the merchants, the sea captains. And it lists the things that were the trade that came through Babylon. And, all of it's kind of recognizable. But then at the end, horses, carriages, I'm at the second part of verse 13, and slaves, even human lives. And some translations talk about human bodies and souls, right? And that idea of the exploitation of people by the powerful and the wealthy is very much alive in our culture right now.
Yeah.
That's one, in the United States, we're still dealing with the aftermath and legacy of slavery, the African slave trade, and its profound generational impacts, as well as the undermining of every effort to rectify the massive inequalities and injustices that were afflicted on Black people. And it's there in all of the controversy around the Epstein files. And this idea that's so powerful on conservative right-wing communities that the rich are exploiting people. And it's probably true. Right? Without question. And how that's going to play out, we don't know as we're sitting here on October 27th, 2025. Yeah. But here we are reading a text from the first century, and it names that very dynamic. Yeah. That this is what the system of wealth and power does. Yeah. Sure. It purchases people. It turns people into commodities for the wealthy and powerful to acquire. And that's horrific. And it's so against the core idea that we are all children of God and all of equal dignity and worth in God's eyes, and should treat one another with compassion and care rather than exploitation and abuse. And I think that it always needs to be said. Yeah. And it needs to be said especially now.
No, that's so useful. And what I read when I read this is, and that energy of exploitation, whereas, slavery is like the extreme example of that. I think I read in this that's the whole plan. Like the whole plan of the city is about exploitation. The whole plan is to forget that we all belong on this planet and kind of need to get by and figure out how to feed our kids. But that the system of life has left that aside. And now we are here to just get what we can and to exploit each other in the process. And I was struck by the end of verse 23, and I'm not sure what your translation says, but mine says, "By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray." What does yours say? Does it use magic spell or something else?
All the nations were deceived by the spell you cast.
Deceived by the spell you cast. I was struck by that. I think a lot of people right now are recognizing the beliefs that they have been indoctrinated in about who is worthy and who is not, and what is, in some ways, white supremacy is a magic spell that those in power have cast upon this planet to save resources for some and leave them away from others. And I thought that was very powerful that line was here, again, thousands of years ago. And yet I think that awareness is very alive right now. How have we been led astray, and how deep that goes into, and it goes into our question around images of women and how sexuality is, all of this is the spell that has led us astray from that foundational understanding that we are all children of God. We're all here alive, with this experience of blessing and unity that, again, John got to experience in the life of Christ. Christ witnessed it to us, and yet this great spell has been cast, and we're all kind of coming.
Yeah, there's. I think we have to note, right, the profound male dominance of the Roman world, of so much of the Western world, but not just the Western world, but that's the world that culturally we are inheritors of, and how much that dominates our culture still today, although progress has been made. That progress is also in peril. There is an active effort to push back any progress that women have made as citizens and as leaders, and to make the world once again make America once again male dominated. And in this text, it's the kings of the earth, right? The gendered term for rulers, who mourn this woman whose feminine power is symbolized, right? And fetishized, I think might be an appropriate word in the way that this text plays it out. And we want to be aware of how deeply John was a child of his culture, and how he's, in his visionary experiences, seeing projections of the feminine into his vision, right? And his projections are wild distortions of any real woman, any real human female. We have the woman who was clothed with the sun, who is pregnant, we know not how, in the story, right? We have the Whore of Babylon, just this incredibly distorted figure, just invested with power, right? And we might make some, we don't have too much time, right? But we might play with the idea of where was the feminine in John? Why was it so down deep and so weak that this got projected out, right? I think that'd be a healthy way for us to hold this imagery. And then it gets projected onto a bride who's a city. So female bodies distorted, human sexuality commodified, right? Huge distortions of human experience in John's vision. It's not saying it's of less value, but we need to bracket that. We need to recognize and bracket those things as we're passing through with John, these visions, so that we might be grounded ourselves. And if we want to know what would it look like, we might, and maybe this is another podcast, I don't know, but you could look at women who've had visionary experiences and see different things. I'm thinking of Julian of Norwich. I'm thinking of Hildegard of Bingen. There are others for sure. And that might be a healthy study, right? To allow other visions that arise from healthy, mature, feminine minds for us to learn from them alongside Revelation.
Yeah. And John is one man among other men. I think this vision does speak to a perversion that has occurred, within humanity. Maybe not over the whole planet. Maybe this is a Western, perversion.
Mm-hmm.
And it's certainly, I think, if you can remember, this isn't like, okay, this is the truth and we all must bow to it, but this is someone's experience, and how is the truth coming out of this person's experience, and what is it speaking to them about? I think it's very meaningful. I mean, as a woman, I definitely recognize that I carry with me patriarchal ideas. So I have a female body, I have some female instincts. My mothering kicked in when our dog was sick the other night, and I wanted to care for him through the night. So I have that in me, but I also have this overlay, this magic spell, of all kinds of patriarchal ideas. So I can read this and I feel like I can relate. It does speak to some of the ways that I too perceive the world and some of the perverted ways that I perceive the world. So yeah, it's very interesting. And I think dream work is so powerful because one of the things you learn in dream work is somebody else's dream can actually have great meaning for you, that we can sort of meet in this area of symbology. And it's not to, doesn't mean there's this like universal truth that we're going to all like pound on each other's heads, but just that we do have a lot in common, and we're swimming in a similar sea of meaning.
Yeah. I think it's worth noting that the fall of Babylon is sudden, right? It's sudden and catastrophic. Verse 17, in just 1 hour, such great wealth was destroyed. And verse 21 to 24, a powerful angel picks up a stone that was like a huge millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, with such violent force, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, and it won't be found anymore. And I think that speaks much more to the idea of transformation of systems than it does physical destruction, right? Because note, the city's not actually hit by the stone thrown into the sea. And there's all that strange duality of the woman seated on the sea, but then it's not the sea, it's the desert, and it's a serpent in the desert, but now the stone's being thrown in the sea. I think we can almost imagine that as like a medicinal treatment for the peoples, right? To make it so that the sea doesn't produce this distortion of the feminine and the distorted masculine alongside of it. I think actually this is a system. And that evocation of the boulder being thrown is actually hearkening back to the book of Daniel. I didn't mean to say Daniel's all bad. If you had that impression, that's not what I mean. Daniel's part of what's inspiring John. He certainly knew the book of Daniel because so many motifs from Daniel come into this work. One of those motifs is in the book of Daniel. The great Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar has a disturbing dream, and he gets all of his wizards and viziers and advisors to tell him the dream and then interpret it for him because he's so troubled by it. No one can, except Daniel, after a time of prayer. And Daniel tells him, you dreamed of a giant statue of yourself. And it was gold at the top, then silver, bronze, and then iron mixed with mud at the feet. And a great stone came out from heaven and smashed the statue and shattered it. And then you're the statue, your kingdom will blah, blah, blah. You can save the interpretation of it later. But the idea was that this system of human hubris and rule is going to be shattered by a stone from heaven.
Yeah. Well, and that
motif is here.
It's right here again.
It's going to be shattered. Yeah.
Well, in some of my Swedenborgian reading, for if there's any nerdy Swedenborgians listening or watching, this is Bruce's commentary. He brings up the Tower of Babel as well, the building of the Tower of Babel and the hubris and the destruction of the tower. And he really makes the point that this destruction, as you said, it happens quickly and it happens at a moment actually of fulfillment. It happens when the city is big and great. It's not a slow decline. It's which I think, I don't know how that fits out into like larger systemic change, but personally, I relate to that there is and it relates kind of to that 6-day motif we've been talking about, that humans are created, we evolve, we have all these abilities to think and to really connect heaven and earth through our minds and our hearts. And it's beautiful and it's big, and just when we think we have a hold on it, that's kind of when we get pushed out again, when there's a crash that's needed, because if we don't get crashed back down, we can be so destructive. And we're here to kind of go through these cycles of growth and destruction, so that we can evolve and be faithful to the one who created us.
Yeah.
So 19. All right, now it gets a little bit happier. We've got some hallelujahs.
A little bit.
A lot. All right, a lot happier. Yeah, now we have the kind of the celebration of the destruction and starting to point towards the Babylon is gone, the prostitute is gone. Now we're getting ready for the wedding of the Lamb and the marriage that will be the holy city.
Preparatory phase before
but
that.
Still big preparatory phase. And you made the point, we were talking earlier, that the end of verse 10, after this kind of celebratory moment, John falls down to worship the angel and is told, do not do it. I am a fellow servant with you and with your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, which is so important. Yeah. I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit.
What you were just saying about the system, Babylon, right? That needing to fall at its peak. If you don't have that fall, you wind up worshiping that system,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
You wind up idolatizing, if I've said that correctly, the system. And that idolatry is baked into how that arose, right? It's this mixing of evil and truth, or good and falsehood, that is inherently going to fail or do harm. And that if we're going to have a system that lasts, it has to be grounded on goodness and truth together.
right.
And so that impulse to make an idol is manifest in the text, and it's going to show up again, and it's showing up here. We're now like fully in the spiritual realm, as we earlier, right? We're on this cycle, and in this cycle, we're fully in the spiritual realm of what we're seeing, and no instruction has been given to the saints, none at all. And in the midst of that, here John receives an instruction when he acts wrongly.
Yeah,
The visions that this angel has given John have so overpowered him that he wants to worship it, or he wants to worship the angel, worship the message. And the message has integrity and tells him, no, don't do that. Keep your focus on the God who is beyond all these things and above all these things. Absolutely essential,
yeah,
absolutely essential in our spiritual lives, to not make an idol of any part of our journey and our progress, but to continually we're serving the God who is greater than we are. We maintain our humility and we strive for goodness. That is essential on the spiritual journey, and Revelation showing us this in a very dramatic way, because
yeah.
John could have been lost at this point, right? If the angel hadn't corrected him.
Yes. And the story's not over. So, yeah, he's told to get up again. And then we have the rider on the white horse. The rider on the white horse is very big in my tradition. Swedenborg wrote a book called The White Horse, and he really points out this is the rider on the right horse is the Christ, bringing the true interpretation of the word, bringing the sword that will cut through all of this falsity that has been depicted in the
So
images.
important. The sword that comes from his mouth.
Yeah.
That is words, not a physical instrument of violence, but truth, ideas, words, not a call to violence, a call to truth speaking.
Telling the truth, right? And that truth, and so for Swedenborg, he saw that as this revelation of the true meaning of Scripture, that he really believed Jesus was showing him, and then he wrote many books about it, describing his personal revelation of what the inner sense of Scripture is. And much of what he said, we're talking about, it's sort of his own work of coming to these symbols of that the sword means truth. And so he saw that, and then he set to work and wrote many books about it, which have been very useful to many humans, or useful to me. And I contest that we're still in that work, because it's about perceiving that truth and living it, which was always his criticism. If you're not living it, you actually almost can't perceive the truth. It's not just an intellectual exercise. It's deeper than that.
And here that circles back, I think, to the Laodicea letter, right? You've received this truth, but you're not cold, you're not indifferent to it, you're not heated like you should be. I'm just spitting you out, right? We need both. We need to take it, recognize its truthfulness, but then manifest it in our choices and actions day by day.
And it's just so easy not to. I think that's what I've really been reflecting on, reading this and holding this hard stuff. Again, in Swedenborg's time, he's laying this against pretty much everybody involved in the Christian church, that the whole thing is just a perversion and not really living out the full message of Jesus Christ. I think probably many people would continue to proclaim that that's mostly true. And it's like maybe every institution just does it. We're all tempted. Every person, we're all tempted to kind of get this little bit of wisdom and knowledge and think, we've arrived. Because we want to feel like we have a handle on things, right? We want to feel like we sort of know what's up. And we're kind of forced in many ways to have an answer or a plan or a goal or, something to hold on to. And I'm so struck by that, how we're all tempted to become complacent in a truth and think we have enough, or that we can fall down and worship now. It's all finally complete. We're all tempted to that. And we're all also constantly, in this process of having to see that there's more.
It is, I think, a challenge to be spiritually mature enough to recognize that the journey we are on will never end.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the desire for it to end is so profound. I've certainly felt that across my journey of healing and my spiritual journey very powerfully so many times. I wanted it to come to an end so that I would know, right? I would know that I'd been healed. I would know God's love with no doubts or uncertainty. I would know I was a good person, right, who would do good things. And we have to learn to accept the profound uncertainty. That's faith, hope, and love are never ending. Right? And Paul says that quite eloquently, right? That means that we have to let go of that desire for an ending and for certainty and learn to be people who, like God having created the world and on some profound level, allowing things to happen that were not what were intended, right? To let go of control. Is that uncertainty? Did God know? We don't have to get into all that distracting. Right now, those things would be distracting from us. But the reality that we have freedom and that the world that we're living in is not the world that God intended, God was able to live into that, for lack of a better word. And that's what we're being invited to do, to live into it, to face it, and to work for its change and transformation.
And I think my takeaway is, yes, we're always going to be changing. So we got to accept that. And there's also, I feel, a deeper call to accept the imperfect things we create along the way when we screw it up. There's such a leveling against religion by a lot of people, that religion is like keeping you from God, or that it's, closing you off, or, because of all of its problems. And it's like, yes, and it's holding truth, that everything has a positive and a negative. And if we just project out, well, all the negatives over there, and that's the problem, and that's the evil one, then it's like, well, okay, well, why don't you go ahead and build something that's going to be the positive one? It's like everything is both. Everything can hold the good, and it can make room for falsity. And I don't know, I find that important to hold, and a part of what we hear in the Revelation, that it's always something new is always breaking through, and we have to be where we are, and both are true at the same time, continually.
Yep.
So the rider on the white horse comes. The words from his mouth brings the truth, clears the path for a renewed era of the Word of God. There's a battle, but it's not a battle. It's not. I guess it doesn't. It ends pretty quickly.
So that's what I mean, right? The beast and the false prophet are seized.
Right.
And then they're thrown into the fiery lake that burns with sulfur, right? This really important motif, because they're suffering. It was said about the woman as well. I meant to not pass that by. Verse 3, who's singing in heaven here? A huge crowd in heaven is singing. And they said a second time, hallelujah, smoke goes up from her forever and always, right? Which sounds like eternal punishment. And I think we have to hold, for my money, because if we start to open the door to eternal punishment, we're opening the door to an abusive God who's either evil or false, and this whole house of cards is going to come back down on us, right? I think what we have to recognize is God has a nature, and if we align ourselves, if we form ourselves in ways that are not harmonious with that nature, we're going to burn, right? Because God is the final reality that grounds all of existence, God's being, God's energy, and its love, its community, its compassion, its truth. It's these essential forces that are what makes material existence possible at the most deep philosophical, theological level. And when we choose to make ourselves incompatible with those things, reality is going to burn us. That's just what's going to happen. And that's not punishment. It looks like it, but it isn't, because we can change. And when we change, that fire refines us. It doesn't consume us.
Yes. What I was going to say is, and once you get to this stage of the spiral, you've seen what Babylon is. Your eyes have been open now. And so now, anytime you even try to operate by those principles, there's a burning. And I think that does sort of happen at some point in our maturation, as you recognize what that's all about, and you just don't want anything to do with it anymore. And it has to kind of keep burning so that you won't inadvertently go back.
Like a child, you learn this is hot.
Yeah.
I'm not going to touch it anymore, right?
Yeah. And I relate to that in my own inner journey as I seek to kind of live more from my heart and my soul. Is like, those old thoughts still come back and they spiral around. They show up all the time, but there's this invitation not to touch them, or not to give them my attention. So we are close to the end. We have the 1,000 years, and then the image of the judgment, which is like the iconic image from Revelation of the dead rising and being judged before the final descent of the holy city.
Probably worth noting that in this it's almost like an interlude. I think the millennium in Christian language, you'll hear that Christian writing, evangelical writing about the millennium. You'll hear about it. I think it's helpful to know that there were progressive Christians who thought the millennium was achievable in this life. And it was part of what animated them for things like hospitals, schools, right? A hopeful evangelism that we could live in a transformed world. It's worth holding. You have to do more research about those folks and what they were doing. But it's worth noting that was something that was drawn from Revelation and inspired Christians of good faith to try and make the world like that. Put a pin on that. We're probably not going to come back to it in this podcast, but put a pin in your own thoughts and hearts and know that that's there. There's been a differentiation of the spiritual forces of evil, right? The dragon, Satan, called out the beast from the sea and then called out the beast from the land. So it was the Antichrist and the false prophet. It's the names that those kind of get given. Antichrist is never used in Revelation, false prophet is. And now the Antichrist and the false prophet have been removed. They're no longer active in the world. And Satan is buried, right? Satan's now pushed down. A pit is opened and an angel comes down and binds them on, at the lowest spiritual level. And that's what allows the millennium to flourish. The spiritual problem of Satan has not been resolved. Whatever the journey of psychic growth, and it probably has to do with that impulse to idol worship and to taking the spiritual and making it about yourself, that's still there. And it gets resolved at the end of the millennium. And again, it's not a battle, it's not a fight. It's like fire from heaven, done. Angel, Satan, into the fire. It's not like there's some dynamic that we have to learn or master. That's not what we're being shown. We're being shown instant transformation in the face of God's increasingly powerful manifest presence. And I was just struck at verse 11. Then I saw a great white throne and the one who was seated on it. Before his face, both earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. So this is God, right? We've seen God on the throne. And God, if you can imagine God kind of impulsing further and closer to what John is seeing and experiencing. And the fullest manifestation of that is the holy city. We're almost there, folks, right? That's the fullest manifestation of it. But at this stage of the spiral journey, God's full presence just dissolves what we know of reality. Earth and heaven just flee away, and we're left with no reference point other than God. And that's the place we're judged from. And this is the second judgment, right? If you made it in the millennium, you're safe. And there was that motif of two harvests in the last cycle, right? It's now come back again. These are two harvests. There's the harvest at the millennium, and then there's this harvest, the final harvest. And whether or not you get to the highest level that Revelation offers us or not is decided at this moment. And it comes back to how you lived.
Well, right? And as you're sharing, it comes back to, a little counterpoint to that. When you were speaking about the earth and heaven fleeing, I immediately had a resonance with the experience of meditation that many people often speak of, where they disappear. Like there's an awareness in that moment that they're not their body, or they're not what they've done. They're not what they're, that there's something about the earth and the heaven fleeing that really speaks to that non-duality of presence that I think is a state that people experience, and that more and more people are experiencing, that I would say is that state of recognizing just pure union with with what is, apart from personality. And I find it very powerful that that occurs before the judgment, because what I perceive as the judgment, and Swedenborg, it's fastation, really. The judgment is when everything is stripped away that you thought you were, and you're just that being that is in union to God. So it's not this judgment of you did good and you did bad. It's not a laundry list of, Santa's going to give you presents and you're not. You can, and as we experience this in the world, you can have done horrible things and then have a conversion experience and all of a sudden shift and live a beautiful life. We know that is a possibility as human beings. So the judgment is not about what are the things I have done, am I good or am I bad, but can I find myself beyond all of the good and the bad that I've done, where there is this union and devotion to God. And that's the part that's the part of me that can enter the holy city. That's the part of me that can continue and that isn't beyond. So it's, I never had seen that line before, but it seems very moving. Earth and heaven flee right before a new earth and a new heaven enter in. And I think we have to have, in many ways, it is that experience of unity that allows us then to step into a new kind of living or a new kind of way of being, because that's the part of us that's all the same. We all have that part in us that is united to God, that's beyond personality and beyond identity and beyond anything of this world. So it's a powerful moment.
And that's when the heavenly city comes to us.
And that's when the holy city comes to us. Yeah. And so that's where we'll go next time.
That's where we'll go next time.
Thank you all for being along the journey. We'll have one more episode next week. And then following that, Ted and I have decided to hold a live Zoom with listeners, probably sometime on Monday, November 17th. So if you have been listening along and would like to join us for a live Zoom, if you have questions that have come up that you can ask us live on that Zoom, you could also send them or leave them in the comments ahead of time and we'll try to engage them. But we'd love to connect with you and be in conversation about all that has emerged during this study.
We'll see you then.
We'll see you then.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new